Good morning, everybody. That's why I love Yale. I can sit and listen to you all day. But thank you so much for your very warm introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. I said it yesterday, I'll say it today, and I'll say it tomorrow. I am so privileged and so honored to be with you for these lectures. I think it is a wonderful opportunity that you offer for somebody like me to engage you in the way my mind tries to work on these important issues. I see that every time I hear the title of the lecture, I look at my final version and it has changed somewhat. Now, just humanly speaking, divinely speaking, I would say that's the fault of the Holy Spirit. Humanly speaking, that's what black preachers always do. But let us look at what we have this morning. For those of you who do not have had a chance to read the background material, today's lecture is about black theology and the challenge of the women in Exodus and the way we have dealt with that or not dealt with that challenge. So let us begin with perhaps an altogether trite observation. As a theology of liberation, nothing is more central to black theology than the Exodus story. Its powerful message of slavery, liberation from bondage, the contestation between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel, the devastating power of the Pharaoh, the liberating power of Yahweh, and the resilient power of the resistance of the suffering, hopeful people. Every expression of black theology testifies to this. Equally true, however, is that black theology, my own included, has without question or self-critique accepted, embraced, and retold the male-centered Exodus as the paradigmatic reference. To be sure, we did listen to the women when they told us that our sexism excluded them and was an inadequate partner, no, actually an obstacle in their struggle for equality in church and in society. But our belated conversion on this point still did not mean that we have taken women seriously in our engagement with the bedrock of our theology, namely liberation. Our continued uncritical embrace of the patriarchal version of the Exodus is a sign not of liberation, but of enslavement to an Egypt mindset. A serious question mark hanging over our reading and interpretation of the Bible and the character and the integrity of our liberation. It is also a major reason why black liberation theology has offered such feeble resistance to the patriarchal fundamentalist religion we spoke about yesterday, now flooding our churches and our countries. Taking the women seriously means recognizing the legitimacy of the firm assertion by J. Cheryl Exum and other feminist scholars that they make, namely that, quote, the Exodus story begins and ends with the women, unquote. This is a statement with serious consequences for black liberation theology, and one we will have to engage as seriously if we are concerned with the character of liberation. What Dolores Williams did with the story of Hagar, Cheryl Exum did with the women of Exodus. And it is a challenge male black theologians have largely left unanswered. The critical work of Donna Noel Fewell and David M. Gunn in their 1993 work, Gender, Power, Promise, and the Subject of the Bible's First Story, offers a succinct summary of the essence of the argument we would like to engage here. The women in the first chapters of Exodus, they write, emerge against the backdrop of vague cardboard collections, of a kind of simplicity that, quote, coaxes the reader to read over the ethical and theological ambiguities that arise when one tries to imagine real people in these roles, end quote. Even so, they continue, the women do emerge as some of the few independent personalities in the story of the Exodus and the wandering. But then, I quote again, as characters, they are perhaps no match for Moses. They are hardly singled out by God personally for confrontation and leadership. For them, there is no burning bush. There are no signs and wonders. They are not called upon to leave their mundane lives and do something extraordinary. God gives them no instructions, offers them no assurances. Yet they, like their predecessors in Genesis, are unknowing but indispensable caretakers of God's promise. Through their mothering, they continue, the role so firmly assigned to women in Genesis 3, they continue to salvage the promise long after the seed has been multiplied. It is their mothering that distinguishes these women as characters and makes way for the nation's leadership. Without them, there would have been no Moses. In the Exodus story, writes feminist Bible scholar Drora O'Donnell-Settle, the women are, quote, of interest only in their relationship to the male protagonist. But it seems to me that all this might be an unnecessarily easy bow to patriarchal, imperial readings of this story, which these analyses are otherwise vowed to resist. The women are doing much more than prepare the listener and the reader for the coming of the true liberator. Here I shall argue that far from being mere conduits for Moses, the women are at the very heart of the liberation of ancient Israel from slavery. They represent the first testimony of faithful resistance to empire the Bible offers us. We need to understand what these women are up against. It was the king of Egypt, is John Calvin's observation, whose perverse strivings drove the Pharaoh and his people to a blind impetuosity, their folly and obstinate lust hurrying them forward so that they compound their opposition to God. The twice repeated inhumanity of the treatment of the slaves, what Calvin calls this dreadful barbarity, is now more than mere power. It is power driven mad by fear. If the Exodus is the locus originis for liberation theology and paradigmatic for our resistance against empire, then, in my view, it is not Moses who is the first prophet of liberation, as black theology has held all along, but rather the women, the midwives, Moses' mother Jochebed, Miriam his sister. It is they, rather than Moses, who represent the powerlessness of Israel over against the brutal power of the Egyptian empire. It is they who encapsulate the meaning of the power of the powerless. And it is they who provide the impetus for the songs of liberation in the Bible, the song of Miriam, the song of Hannah, and the Magnificat of Mary, and as a subsequence, the sorrow songs and the freedom songs of black liberation struggles across the centuries. Then the Exodus and the story of liberation have their focus not on the burning bush, but on the birthing stool, the riverbank, and the seashore. J. Cheryl Exum was one of the first to pay detailed attention to the story from a feminist theological point of view in her You Shall Let Every Daughter Live from 1983. But her slight dissatisfaction with the way she had treated it in her first attempt required her to revisit Exodus and the women in an article titled Second Thoughts About Secondary Characters, both now taken up in Atalia Brenner's Feminist Companion to the Bible in 2001. In her you shall let every daughter live. Exam has done exhaustive work on the women in Exodus 1 and 2. Her approach then was that of a, quote, close reading of the text or rhetorical criticism, which investigates the narrative in its present form on the premise that an understanding of its literary contours will aid us in perceiving its meaning, end quote. Such an approach may still be useful, for the women in Exodus 1 and 2 are portrayed positively, she writes. They are active and enterprising. Their actions are important for the future of the Israelite people. The text offers much that is a striking affirmation of the role of women in the opening chapters of Exodus, she concludes. Now, however, in her second thoughts, she reconsiders the fact that that very same approach places, quote, logocentric constraints on feminist criticism. One now has to see the positive portrayal of the women in Exodus 1 and 2 nevertheless serves male interests. What androcentric interest does this positive presentation of the role of women serve here, she asks. For example, God behind the scenes, using the weak and lowly to overcome the strong and powerful, the inferior but clever women successfully defying the powerful Pharaoh. The point is made through the portrayal of the exceedingly foolish Pharaoh. And she says, so foolish that even women can outwit him. In the intense focusing on infants, the women affirm traditional roles, that of mothering and nurturing, for instance, which appeals to women's subordinate position, as does the fact that their eggs are confined to the domestic and not the public sphere, where patriarchal power remains unchallenged. While respectfully keeping these observations of these theologians in mind, I am not sure that this is the full picture that emerges from this story. The tyranny of the Pharaoh we meet in Exodus 1 leaves no room for misunderstanding. The Egyptian taskmasters aim to bend, to wear out anyone's strength, to break them down physically, to crush the Israelite slaves. Their goal was not only physical, it was also to crush their spirit, so as to banish the very wish for liberty. So argue German scholars Keil and Delitzsch. This Pharaoh, writes Benno Jacob, suggested three means of oppression. The first was forced labor, the second, infanticide, and the third was mass infanticide. This despotism, as all despotism, knows only two paths, he writes, enslavement and murder. Shirfa and Puah, the Hebrew midwives, defy the command of Pharaoh to kill the baby boys even as the Israelite women are on the birth stool. They become the symbol of resistance, standing in for the whole people of Israel. It is not just the people under imperial rule who cannot stand tyranny and oppression, however, John Calvin writes, reflecting not only the political situation of his own time, but building a framework for resistance against such conditions generally. God himself cannot endure tyrants, writes Calvin, and God listens in empathy to the secret groans of those who live under them. That in his commentary on Isaiah 14, verses 7 and 8. Elsewhere, Calvin will radicalize this thought considerably. Not only does he tell us that the longing for freedom and justice is implanted in us by the Lord, and not only that the cries against oppression are heard by God, but it is, I quote him, as if God hears God's self in the cries of the oppressed. That's in his commentary on Habakkuk 2:11. Now the cries against oppression are no longer the secret groans he talked about a minute ago. The oppressed now cry out. And God no longer just listens in empathy. God now becomes the poor and the oppressed. And their cry, how long, becomes God's cry. Their impatience with tyranny becomes God's impatience. Their struggles are now God's struggles. In a sentence that underscores the necessity of endurance and revolutionary patience, ancient Israel will come to need so much in the wilderness as this story unfolds. Calvin writes that resistance to oppression does indeed bring risks and unforeseen changes, but, he says, only a degraded people could prefer the yoke of tyranny to the inconveniences of change. And that's in his commentary on Matthew 2, verse 9. Calvin's judgment on those who, for some reason or another, are afraid to resist oppression is quite harsh. There is no doubt that God has struck with a spirit of cowardice those who, like asses, willingly offer their shoulders for burdens, he says. And that's on Isaiah 3, verse 12. But since tyrants do not rest their injuries until the wretched people have altogether given up, resistance is inevitable. And for that resistance, Calvin finds inspiration in the example of the Hebrew midwives who stood up against the Pharaoh. All this is in stark relief as we read the story of Shiphrah and Puah. Drawing lessons from the Pharaoh's ever harsher oppression of the people of Israel, Calvin makes sure that there is no misunderstanding about the intentions of oppressors. First, he teaches us, tyrants want the people to become inured to their own oppression, to meekly accept that there is no alternative to slavery. Tyranny invariably loses all regard for justice, he says. There are no bounds to its harshness because it knows that this is the best receipt for them, governing them so to oppress them that they dare not open their mouths until they grow hardened and, as it were, callous to their own bondage. The best ally of the oppressor, writes South Africa's Steve Beecher, as if he had read Calvin, which I know he hadn't, is the mind of the oppressed. But this, Calvin says, is nothing but tyrannical insolence. This tyranny must thus be resisted because, and this is Calvin's second lesson to oppressed people in resistance against empire and in search of freedom, it serves the purpose of all tyrants, designed, quote, in order that they, the people, may renounce the hope presented to them from on high, end quote. In other words, not just to helplessly give up under pressure of the tyrant, but willfully renounce all hope for freedom and all faith in God and in God's justice. This is the worst thing oppressed people could do. To renounce hope is not only to be resigned to one's own oppression, it is, in fact, to invite death. Whereas elsewhere, for Calvin, it is the tyrant who denies God by injustice and oppression. Here, it is the people who deny God, but by renouncing all hope in God's liberating power. Renouncing all hope in God is the same as depriving God of God's right to do justice in love and freedom. Calvin goes on, the tyrant will not stop until he, quote, has destroyed in them all recollection of God. I take that to mean that erased from their memory all the promises of God and all God's deed of liberation through which Israel came to know God. It means to erase all recollection of the truth that God is a God who loves and desires justice, that God's own freedom to be a God of shalom and compassionate justice is the very guarantee for the freedom of God's people. to erase all remembrance of the life-saving truth that against that love for justice and freedom, no tyrant, however mighty and powerful, shall prevail. Within this context, we dare not diminish the agency of the women in their resistance to Pharaoh or their place in Israel's and subsequently in our liberation story. They are no mere cardboard figures. In the critical reading of Exum, Nolan, Fuel, and Gunn above, the role of the women is inextricably linked to mothering, a patriarchal ploy to make sure the women and we, the readers, know their place. But it seems to me that the story is not so much about mothering than about emphasizing defiance of illegitimate authority and resistance to abuse of power. This is a story of the overturning of patriarchal power in Egypt and within Israel. In their defiant actions, the women challenge the Pharaoh even as they are challenging the patriarchal framework of their own lives. The image conjured up here is not one of passive mothering, of cuddling babies to their breast. It is far more one of the women against enormous odds and facing the threat of death, standing up, standing their ground, actively blocking the path of the ungodly. The narrative will eventually tip the scales toward Moses, but at this point, the women cannot be deprived of the role they have claimed for themselves as empowered and powerful agents of defiance and liberation here at the very origins of Israel's deliverance. If we read the story as a story of faithful resistance to empire, the emphasis does not fall on mothering but on defiance, not on weakness as a typical feminine trait, but on how weakness as a result of oppression is overturned and emerges as courageous defiance of an unimaginably powerful enemy. That is how powerlessness, through the agency of the powerless themselves, is turned into strength. The male deity stays behind the scenes, and the Israelite patriarchal male is nowhere in sight. The patriarchy the midwives are facing is not simply domestic, as Exum asserts. It is instead thoroughly imperialistic. At this point, the birth of Hebrew babies is no longer a family affair. Slavery, and now the Pharaoh's death command, has turned it into a deeply political issue for the empire. In the Pharaoh's view and in his policy, the empire's geopolitical standing, its present stability, and its future prosperity, as well as its historic importance, are what are at stake here. The implications are not simply domestic. For Egypt, the implications are global. Furthermore, the women do much more than just set the stage for Moses. God's plan for the future of the children of God, writes Terence Fretheim, rests squarely on the shoulders of one of his helpless sons, a baby in a fragile basket. But is it not more correct to say that as the story is told and its priorities are set before us, God's plan for the future of the children of Israel rests squarely on the shoulders of these two powerless women? And it is in the way in which this powerlessness is turned into acts of power, challenging and finally nullifying the power of the empire, that is the most striking feature of the Exodus story. It seems the narrator could not help himself, nor could he deny what stands out as undeniable truth. The story of Israel's liberation does begin with the women. It is not so much that without them there would have been no Moses. It is that without them there would have been no liberation at all. It is true that Shiphrah and Puah did not experience a special call from God as Moses did. It is also true that they saw no burning bush, heard no voice, have had no engagement with the divine, as has been pointed out. But does that delegitimize their calling and their place in the act of liberation from slavery? I do not think so. God is not the subject of a single verb in their various undertakings, writes Freutham. True, but that need not be a disqualification in my view. Can it not also mean that these women, unlike Moses, required no divine prompting in order to do what is needed to be done? Can it not be that they had that intuitive ingenuity we spoke about yesterday? That consciousness for the kairos moment, knowing that if they did not seize that moment, it would pass Israel by and freedom would never come. Can it not mean that unlike Moses, they did not need God to remind them of what is right, what serves justice, and how the righteous should respond to injustice and oppression? There comes a time in a people's life, said Nelson Mandela in the Rivonia trial in 1963, that we must choose, submit or fight. We chose to fight. That is exactly what the midwives are doing. They decide to fight. They had no direct encounter with God, also true. But then there was no need on Yahweh's part to cajole or prod and push them to hear and understand their calling and the need for liberation. That prodding and pushing and overcoming of resistance seems to be a predominantly male thing in the Bible. Here it is Moses. In the New Testament, on Resurrection Sunday, it is the male disciples. So the women stay at the cross on Friday. They are in hiding. The women get up on Saturday morning to go and look for Jesus. They are in hiding. On Sunday morning, the women go and meet Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, at the grave. They are still in hiding. Don't emerge until Sunday night. No wonder Moses clearly needed signs and wonders in order for him to be convinced. No wonder also that his first instinct before the Pharaoh was to resort to signs and wonders. In the first chapters of Exodus, however much it is called the book of Moses, it is not the hesitancy of Moses, but the courageous spontaneity of the women, not the reflexive reluctance of Moses, but the intuitive ingenuity of the women, not the awkward disinclination of Moses, but the openness toward defiance and liberations of the women that proved to be decisive and that set the stage not for Moses, but for God's work of liberation in the life of Israel and in history. Unlike Moses, the midwives come to us with a liberation-minded consciousness, properly understood, waiting for the miracle of a voice from a burning bush, or boldly redefining freedom in unhesitating judgment on evil and decisive action against evil, which is real, radical, and revolutionary. Read thus, the signs and wonders are not in the first instance of a proof of God's preference for Moses, and certainly not signs of the power of Moses and Aaron. They are perhaps more signs of God's tested patience with and God's exasperated accommodation of Moses. If this reading is right, Shiphrah and Puah can hardly be described as being no match for Moses. That may be what the male narrator intended in retelling his story and what the male audience expected. But it is also what the male narrator could not hide or suppress or ignore. The Spirit will have her way. That is what a reading against the ways of empire will discover. They are only no match for Moses because the patriarchal mindset requires the women to be set aside for a male deliverer, chosen and blessed by God. Looked at from a liberationist point of view, with Moses and his inopportune impetuousness, his misplaced judgment of his own position, as well as of the mindset of the oppressed Hebrews, followed by his unproductive, self-imposed exile in the desert, it is Moses who, in fact, is no match for the women. Terence Fretheim remarks, God uses the weak, what is low in the world, to shame the strong. Rather than using power as it is usually exercised in the world, God works through persons who have no obvious power. Indeed, they are unlikely candidates for the exercise of power. That is true. Exum, though, seems ambivalent about this description. But think of this. What power do the women actually unleash upon the Pharaoh here? The women are not weak because they are women. They are weak because they are being oppressed, first by the empire as members of a subjugated people, then as women in a patriarchal society, then as women whose role in the liberation story needs to be suppressed, faded, and submerged in order to allow the male deliverer to take center stage. The midwives raised the question, not only about gender and struggle, but also and perhaps primarily about one's readiness for full, intelligent, and courageous participation in the struggle, male or female. A small detail, like the mentioning of the names of the women, helps us to better understand how significant this moment is. Exodus is also called the Book of Names. In a book which begins with naming all and only the sons of Jacob, the naming of two women is remarkable indeed. Nechama Rubinstein makes the point that, quote, between the listing of the names of the sons of Jacob in the first 5 lines of Shemot and the naming of Moses in chapter 2, verse 10, the only other people to merit a name at all are the midwives Shifra and Puah. That leaves 28 lines of anonymity. So she asks, why do the midwives have this honor? They have this honor, I would suggest, not because they facilitated the birth of Moses and not because they display such excellent motherly instincts, but because in the midst of an unnameable oppression, they seize the moment to become the primary agents in the act of liberation in their resistance to the might of the Pharaoh. By the naming of their names, the ones who usually do not merit any naming or recognition, the marginalized ones not counted, are placed in the center of the most foundational story of ancient Israel's life and faith. Naming turns the story inside out, calls attention to something completely out of the ordinary. Naming them endows them with the power to influence, shape, and claim the narrative. The story has no beginning without them. The great deeds of God have no holding center without them. The history of Israel coming into being makes no sense without them. And not as mothers and nurturers, but as resistors to empire and the shapers of Israel's destiny. 2 women change and in 28 lines of anonymity, they transform history. They are named because the breaking of the chains, the liberation from slavery, the Exodus begin with them. The fact that the midwives are faded out of the story by the close of chapter 1 with its abrupt ending, and that chapter 2 begins with the birth of Moses without any reference to the women, marks a return to that anonymity of the 28 lines in chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, verse 8. It is not simply an omission, this, it is a conquest. And the conquest will reassert itself on the seashore in the Song of Moses. It will be complete when the military conquest of Canaan becomes the dominant narrative. The women are named, but the Pharaoh is not. It is not because, as some have suggested, because he is unimportant or to be dismissed as inconsequential. The consequences of his power are terrifying, and the story knows it. It is rather because he represents what oppressed people already always know: the raw, untamed, arrogant power of empire. He is known by what he does, which is what empires always do: dealing in death and destruction, oppressing the innocent and annihilating the vulnerable. But here is the point I would like to make here. To the victims of empire in Exodus, it really makes no difference what his name is. He does what every king of Egypt has done before him and what every king of Egypt will do after him. Oppressed peoples have learned at great cost not to fall prey to new expectations as a result of power shifts within the ruling classes. That is a game for the privileged and the pseudo-innocent. It made no difference to oppressed South Africans whether the name of our tyrant was Hans Strydom or Hendrik Verwoerd, John Foster or P.W. Botha, Andries Treurnig or F.W. de Klerk. Every single one of them represented the might of apartheid and the aim, overtly or covertly, but always unwaveringly, remained our continued oppression and their domination. So long as the framework of domination and subjugation holds, subtle shifts of power amongst the dominant classes should never be mistaken as beneficial to struggles for justice and freedom. Likewise, for those living in the shadow of empire, it does not change reality, whether we are faced with Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump. It is the systems they represent that count. The details of their destructive rule may vary. The one may prefer bombs and guns. The other prefer bombs and life-crushing sanctions visited upon children. Another may choose bombs, rendition, and torture. Yet another may have his own personal Tuesday morning killing list and prefer assassination by drone. And yet another may have glowing praise for the beautiful chocolate cake he was eating while bombing Syria, or announce his great next war from a golf course. Their lust for power remains the same. The differences do not matter. The targets of their arrogance remain the same. The aims of world domination remain the same. The suffering of the innocent across the world remains the same because they all represent empire. For the people who suffer and are in resistance, it is enough to know that they are facing Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh, in whatever shape or form, of whatever color, gender, or creed, must be resisted because they are Pharaoh. Not at all surprising, fear plays a significant role in this passage. We see this at three contrasting but not contradictory levels. First, the creation of a climate of fear in the Egyptian population goes hand in hand with the scapegoating of the Israelite slaves that you find in chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. The politics of fear always creates room for the demonization that in turn creates room and provides justification for the politics of oppression and annihilation. Second, the politics of fear create the necessary space for the collective condition of the politics of deceit, preemptive destruction, and disproportionate collective punishment. Exodus 1 verse 8 reads, "Let us deal shrewdly with them." And once again, John Calvin proves instructive. This, Calvin says, is the politics of preemptive war. Calvin notices that the word used in verse 8, chakam, is often taken in the sense of to overreach with cunning. The empire lies, and deceives and pretends that the preemptive murderous intent is necessary for the security and the good of the nation. Calvin calls it, quote, a specious yet fallacious pretext. He speaks of that detestable sentiment that we should beforehand, in other words, be proactive in crime, used by wicked and desperate characters, even though they know that it is unjust and absurd. Yet it is commonly considered the best mode of precaution, so that only those are accounted provident, which means prudent, who consult for their own security by injuring others if occasion requires it. To me, Calvin seems to be describing the preemptive war policy so calamitously normalized by the Bush administration in cahoots with Britain's Tony Blair in their pretext for the so-called war on terror, and since then, however disastrously, still mindlessly called upon in every subsequent undeclared war. With deep insight, John Calvin writes, from this source, almost all wars proceed. Because while every prince fears his neighbor, this fear so fills him with apprehension that he does not hesitate to cover the earth with human blood. Hence, too, amongst private individuals arises the license for deceit, murder, rapine, lying, because they think that injuries would be repelled too late unless they respectively anticipated them. But this, Calvin says, is a wicked kind of cunning, however it may be varnished over with the specious name of foresight, unjustly to molest others for our own security. Third, the fear the Pharaoh still needs to instill in all the people reflects the fear in his own mind. And it is this fear that spawns the irrationality of the strategies he employs in those 2 chapters. The instruction to kill all the Hebrew boys goes not just to the midwives, but to the Egyptian people as a whole. It is meant to strike even greater fear into the hearts of the slaves. But it is the fear of the Pharaoh himself that drives him to the madness and the foolishness of his decisions. Quite deliberately, he turns his own personal fear into a national phobia, as he transfers it to all Egyptians. It now becomes the collective responsibility and, as a result, the collective guilt of all Egyptians. The genocide of the Hebrew boys is now the shared guilt of the nation. Their fear of the other is turned into a desire to annihilate the other. It now becomes clear that their fear is a shared national blindness, a macabre bonding. The fear that leads to the destruction of the other is exactly what is now holding the nation together. No one can plead neutrality, moreover. What up to now has been done in their name would now be done by their own hands. U.S. historian Norman Pollack explains this further. The Cold War, he writes, never ended, not even for that matter gone underground. Rather, its permanence was set in stone. Penetration, ideology, militarism, all, when tightly integrated, bespeak strength, interlaced, however, with fear. Else why the constant emphasis on force, the muscularity of response, overkill, being ever vigilant? To the systemic structural characteristics this displays must be added the psychological composite of ethnocentrism and xenophobia, in which fear of the stranger, the other, the enemy at the gates falls naturally into place with the erection of defensive walls to reinforce an all-important dichotomy of we and they in international politics. We saw this with all its disastrous effects in Nazi Germany. We see it in the American War on Terror. We see it in the Rwandan genocide and what happened in Burundi. We see it in the ethnic cleansing now effected by Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinians, and in Myanmar vis-à-vis the Rohingya people. These are the everyday frightening examples of what this means. The Bible does not deny the overwhelming reality of the politics of fear in the rule of empires. The context of chapters 1 and 2 makes that crystal clear. In this context of fear, obedience to the empire, which can inflict punishment or can offer protection from the other, we are taught to fear. And it becomes a crucial way of survival, an essential way of life. Rising up against this fear, recognizing the politics of fear as a device for control and subjugation, is one of the first lessons the story of the midwives teaches us. Because the midwives, instead of fearing the Pharaoh, feared God. And that means they consciously and consistently countered the fear for the Pharaoh with their trust in Yahweh. As the midwives are summoned before Pharaoh twice, he was the visible, tangible, embodied, and manifested presence of fear. Yahweh for them was the intangible and invisible, but nonetheless real presence of courage, faith, and defiance. Pharaoh summoned the midwives not once but twice. It's crucial that we remember that here, as always, in order to maintain domination and the status quo of oppression and exploitation, the empire always needs the collaboration of the subjugated. That is the primary reason for calling the Hebrew midwives to account here. Pharaoh's plan cannot work without them. When he resorts to his plan B, he descends into the abyss of a desperation that not only defies reason, more importantly, it also loses whatever legitimacy the cooperation of the oppressed may have given those plans. By the same token, he also loses the advantage of confusion created elsewhere and in the minds of the oppressed by the cooperation of the oppressed in their own oppression. As long as the women stood firm in their refusal, all excuses within captive Israel for neutrality, for resignation, or collaboration are voided. As long as the women stood where they stood, the men can say what they want, but they can no longer work with Pharaoh. In this story, the king of Egypt is under the impression that these two Hebrew women will comply with his wishes, writes Hebrew Bible scholar Martin North. That's not surprising, since power always expects unquestioning obedience from the powerless. Resistance to empire begins with understanding and refuting the expectations of empire. And it is not just civil disobedience we are seeing here, as both John Durham and Terence Fretheim have it. Shrifa and Puah are not passively disobeying. They are actively working against the command of the Pharaoh. Passive disobedience would have been, in the words of South African philosopher Adam Small, protest as a kind of begging. But protest within the context of refusal, defiance, and sacrificial commitment, risking their lives and upending the ways of empire, is entirely different. Now they were no longer begging, they were issuing a demand, namely that the Pharaoh take responsibility for the death of the Hebrew children upon himself. They are willing to die for the sake of the life of the Hebrew children. No wonder the Pharaoh is outraged, the Bible says. So the midwives in this interview with the king responded. It was a wonderfully resourceful response. Right fuel and gun. There is no sign of timidity or false modesty or what the privileged classes call peasant cunning, as far as I could see. Wise to the thinking of empire, they count on the delusionary superiority complex oppressors always have. That the slaves behave like animals and breed like animals and have the appetites of animals is a natural way for them to think of the savages under their control. Subjugated peoples know this only too well. We also know that it is a blinding stupidity, but oppressors seem to have a deep need for it. But does this, as Exum expresses her suspicions of the patriarchal motives of the male narrator of the story, make the Pharaoh so exceedingly foolish that he is even outwitted by mere women? Now there is indeed an exceeding foolishness about oppression and oppressors. They always believe that their power is unassailable, that the ones they have conquered will always remain their helpless victims, that their brutality is an unbreakable shield, that their violence is a redemptive force, and that they are innocent because they are entitled, and that their exceptionalism makes them untouchable and hence godlike. That is indeed the height of foolishness. But that does not make them less lethal, less prone to destruction, less averse to acts of extreme cruelty and death. The women are facing a formidable foe, a powerful monarch, a death-dealing tyrant. The foolishness of oppression does not nullify the reality of all these things. The Pharaoh might have been extremely foolish, but there is a reason why his back-breaking policies of oppression continued. After a long time, the text tells us, the king of Egypt died. We cannot even begin to imagine what that long time means. And clearly, whoever succeeded him understood why it was important for Egypt that these policies are kept in place. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out, says chapter 2, verse 23. Western scholarly critique on this point, diminishing the character of the resistance against empire by overemphasizing the foolishness of the oppressor, is perhaps not entirely surprising. Subjugated peoples, however, under the vicious oppression of imperial forces, would be careful never to undermine the agency and belittle the courage of resistors by de-emphasizing the power and the murderous intent of oppressors. Only those who have not experienced oppression would dare to do so. From one point of view, Adolf Hitler was exceedingly foolish to hold up his dream of a 1,000-year racially pure Reich as an ideal for which millions of lives should be sacrificed. But that foolishness did not make him less lethal for the victims of his evil madness. Madeleine Albright, in making an infamous statement on national television that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children as a result of the crippling sanctions regime exercised by the US was a price worth paying, seeming without caring that neither she nor her country would be paying any price at all. That was exceedingly foolish, but she remained nonetheless extremely deadly for those helpless children. George W. Bush and Tony Blair, in resorting to lies and deceit that would be found out to justify their lust for war and profit in their disastrous invasion of Iraq, were exceedingly foolish, but did not nullify the appalling destruction they represented to those lands they invaded and the people of those lands, and the consequences for America itself, morally and otherwise. Empires have always had genocidal intent. The 20th century empire is no different. It does not only have the intent, it has, in the words of George W. H. Bush, the first one, the means to back it up. The U.S. is doing this directly with its Saudi Arabian allies in Yemen and in Palestine in collaboration with Israel. But there is also the more subtle but no less shocking drift towards genocide in the United States itself, in what President Obama allowed to happen through his stance on the Standing Rock resistance. And I wish I had the time to read that whole thing. But it boils down to this. In the middle of the deadly attacks of the defenders of the sacred, we have a president that gravely ponders the situation, saying he will let things play out. This while nonviolent, peaceful, praying protesters of the environment, protectors of the environment, and the deeper sacred heart of a powerless people are set upon by dogs, assaulted by rubber bullets, sound cannons, chemical weapons. That is strange beyond comprehension, writes journalist William Boardman, but that is essentially the dark heart of empire we see here. It is foolishness, but it's the foolishness of Psalm 42. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. This Pharaoh suggested three means of oppression. The first was forced labor, the second, infanticide, and with that, his wisdom was exhausted. For the third was mass infanticide, says Benno Jacob. Despotism, he continues, is intellectually barren. It is capable of only two paths, enslavement and murder. Endless deceit through numerous intelligence agencies, endless threats and intimidation through limitless powers of surveillance, endless exploitation through boundless and unregulated capitalist greed, endless war for the sake of endless profits, announcing death decrees from the opulence of a golf course or in the mindlessness of a tweet. None of this are signs of the intellectual maturity necessary for the complexities of our world today. None of this are signs of the wisdom that sees any worth in peace, dignity, justice, respect for life, and reverence for the preciousness of the earth. Like the Pharaoh, the empire does not see that its exercise of blind power is a stupidity beyond belief. The intellectual creativity of the women not only contrasts that of Pharaoh's despotism, it also contrasts the lack of imagination and mechanical engagement of the Pharaoh by Moses and Aaron. Just as Moses' unthinking act of violence did not work, the use of tricks and magic as signs of authority does not work in front of Pharaoh's throne. The magicians of Pharaoh can do exactly the same. It's a far cry from the creative resistance of the women, for it is mere imitation. They do not rise above the level of the empire's competencies and therefore fail to accomplish their mission. In the employment of signs, Moses and Aaron get caught in a senseless cycle of reproduction of signs of death, a snake, a leprous hand, water turning to blood. The men, in their desire to match power with power, are caught in the syndrome of recycled fear. The creative, intelligent resistance of the women breaks that cycle of violence and fear and bring life-giving acts. What was intended to be a death-dealing instrument, the birth stool, and what was a place fraught with danger and stalked by death, the riverbank, are both turned into life-giving, life-affirming spaces by the courageous, life-giving defiance of the women. The women are the representatives of that wisdom, that Sophia, that exposes, mocks, challenges, overturns the wisdom of the Pharaoh, of which we read in chapter 1, verse 9, the political cunning that can only lead to disaster, as we have heard from Calvin. The women are a reminder that brute force is brute force. It is not a creative power. That creative power is in the hands of the powerless. Courage, faith, hope, the fear of Yahweh, which is the trust in the trustworthiness of God. It is not wit, it is wisdom that determines the women's response to the Pharaoh's questions in 1 verse 17. Not only do the women lay the foundation of Israel's faith, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs and in the Psalms. They also lay the foundation of the truth and conviction as expressed by Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Not by might shall one prevail. A black theology rooted in the courage and the wisdom of the woman would have had a better grasp of the barrenness of our current politics globally and at home, would have discerned the moral and political bankruptcy of the African National Congress, would have seen the emptiness of Obama's post-racialism and Mandela's rainbow nationism. We would have been better prepared for the violence visited upon our people in the Marikana massacre by their own liberation movement, would have had a better understanding of the reasons behind Black Lives Matter and Feast Must Fall, would have had a better grasp of the rightful anger of a disillusioned younger generation we have so bitterly betrayed. With the wisdom of the women of the Exodus, we could have been a better bulwark in the continued struggles for a freedom defined by ourselves, a better partner in the fight for the preservation of the character of our liberation, for the preservation of the sanity of our politics and of the sanctity of our humanity. In all of this, my hope is that we now might require the wisdom to know that it is not yet too late. Thank you so much.